Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're eager to engage with all of you and discuss the importance of addressing trauma and rebuilding school communities. Before we begin, and on behalf of the Rennie Center, I would like to say a few words about the horrific killing of George Floyd and the other acts of violence against communities of color, particularly Black men, around the country. I do not think words can express the anguish many of us feel. Yet we stand in solidarity with those crying out in pain, anger, and grief over this horrific loss of life, and the deep systemic racism that created the conditions for this injustice to occur. At the Rennie Center, we stand side by side with those working to advance equity in all sectors. We cannot discuss education or student outcomes and opportunities without grappling with the reality of an inequitable system grounded in a culture that privileges whiteness. As we seek to advance a vision of education where all young people are valued, respected, and prepared to thrive, equity is not only central to our work, equity is our work. Amid our heartache, we take renewed strength from the cries for justice we hear today from all corners of the land. We echo these calls and add our voice to the larger chorus clamoring for an end to racism and oppression. Thank you. Welcome to the Rennie Center's webinar for addressing trauma and rebuilding school communities. My name is Chad D'Entremont. I'm the Executive Director of the Rennie Center for Education Research and Policy. Rennie, as it is known, is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our mission is to ensure educational decision-making is based on deep knowledge and evidence of effective practice to ensure all students, especially those who have been historically marginalized and oppressed, have opportunities to achieve lasting life success. Allow me to provide a brief agenda for today. I am joined by several esteemed guests with substantial expertise in the holistic development of children and youth. They are experienced in helping schools respond to and support students in overcoming barriers to health, well-being, and learning. Whether this means confronting moments of crisis that we are experiencing now, or addressing daily hardships that so many of our students face. Our guests include Lindsey MacIntyre, Boston Public Schools High School Superintendent and former headmaster of the Jeremiah E. Burke High School in Boston, Lindsey Minder, Manager of Partnerships at Transforming Education, and Nadja Riley, Associate Director for the Friedman Center for Child and Family Development at William James College. We will start with an overview of the Rennie Center's Back to School Blueprint, followed by brief presentations by each of the panelists where they can provide a bit more information on their backgrounds and experience, as well as their work to support students and families. We will then engage in a panel discussion followed by Q&A. As a friendly reminder, please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the webinar. We will answer them at the end of this session. The Rennie Center's Back to School Blueprint is premised on the idea that when school doors eventually reopen, things will be different. The short-term solutions we have been discussing to provide essential services and facilitate remote learning are absolutely necessary, but address only one dimension of a much larger challenge facing our education system. When students return, they will bring with them the effects of trauma. Most will have fallen behind academically, and an increased number of students may drop out. On top of that, the novel coronavirus has produced massive shocks to the economy, which seem likely to continue for some time. As we confront the possibility of a long and costly recession, we must also anticipate its effects on students, including increasing poverty, homelessness, and instability, not to mention pressure on older students to contribute to family incomes. And these challenges have only been added to by the events of the last 9 days. If we're to rise to meet these challenges, we must act now. There is good news. Many of our school leaders and teachers possess the knowledge and skill to develop an effective response. Both now and before the COVID-19 outbreak, educators have been on the front lines responding to students in need and unlocking their strengths and passions through effective and innovative programming. We can use these models to build an effective long-term response. The Running Center's Back to School Blueprint is a series of research-based action steps to help schools and community partners implement practices that not only address the pressing issues facing our students when schools reopen, but also serve as building blocks for a more supportive and high-performing system in general. The first steps in the blueprint are addressing student and family trauma and rebuilding school communities. Past research has reported that over 50% of adults experience trauma in childhood. It is an understatement to suggest that this statistic underrepresents the current moment. We must help school leaders and teachers better recognize trauma, understand its effects on learning, and apply trauma-sensitive and healing-centered practices to create safe school environments and build stronger relationships with students. We can build on models like the Baker School in Brockton, where school-wide community to trauma-sensitive practice means positive morning greetings, one-on-one relationships with students, clear behavioral expectations, and appreciation and engagement with students' cultural backgrounds. Please allow me to show you what I mean. You see in front of you links to our first two action guides for the Back to School Blueprint. One on helping students heal from trauma, the second on rebuilding school communities. I'm now clicking on addressing trauma. This will bring you to an interactive guide filled with resources, videos, further research and reading, and tools and strategies that you can use in your own practice, whether in school or in the community, to better support students and families. Each guide is structured the same way. If you hit details, it will take you to a brief overview of the guide, followed by a list of the topics and the resources that follow underneath. You can also hit begin on the guide, and you'll have a table of contents to your right, as well as a main page that takes you through the content for each section you are currently focused on. Most of the guides will follow a similar format, although all will have slightly unique features. A definition at the beginning, initial sections focusing on how staff in school can build their own capacities, then followed with specific strategies to be used on sites that are directed at supporting students, and then finally a list of action steps. With the Addressing Trauma action guide, let's take a slightly deeper look. If we move halfway down and go to creating a safe school environment, which I just clicked on, you can begin to see how resources are structured within the guide. It goes through a look at what a safe school looks like, giving you concrete and practical examples. For example, this diagram of a school building has useful tips throughout. For instance, using physical space like a library to have literature, artwork, flags, and signs that represent students' diverse cultures and experiences to create a powerful sense of belonging among the entire community. As you continue to go down, you will see that creating a safe school is the introduction to the other categories that fall beneath this topic and make up a safe school overall. So if we were to click on focusing on relationships, you would then receive a series of specific tools and strategies that you can begin to implement to strengthen your own communities and the experiences of your students, your families, and faculties. Strategies from building empathy by sharing personal stories, to making time for one-on-one relationships, to using a 2x10 strategy, which is a way of engaging through talking with students on a regular basis, to getting to know students' home culture. As you've seen, as I will go through the guide, the resources vary and are designed for diverse learners who like to engage in different ways. One is represented by this video right here about cultivating trust with one-on-one relationships. Finally, each action guide ends with a series of action steps, a checklist of specific things that school leaders can do now to address trauma and rebuild communities, what requires longer-term planning, as well as how teachers can act individually within their classrooms. Ultimately, this action guide is designed to spur action, to provide tools that we can all benefit from using to improve our practice and engagement with students. But like anything, there's far more information out there. And each action guide concludes with an opportunity to go deeper by providing additional resources that individuals may want to explore in order to deepen their practice and better serve their school communities. With that, I will end the review of the action guides for the Back to School Blueprint. The purpose of the webinar today is not to give you all the content. Quite frankly, we hope you'll go to the guides and explore them yourself. We think that experience will be far richer. But to let you know that they exist, to elevate some of the issues, and then to hear from the experts on what we should be doing to move forward and implement these best practices in our school communities. And with that, I would like to turn to our panelists, starting with Dr. Lindsey MacIntyre, Boston Public Schools High School Superintendent and former headmaster of the Jeremiah E. Burke High School in Boston, to say a few words. Lindsey?
Yes, and good morning, everybody. I am truly excited to be here to have this opportunity to address trauma and rebuilding our community. Schools will never be the same. And so while we talked about new normals and challenging the status quo in the past, we have come to the time where it has to be more than a conversation. It has to be a set of strategies and opportunities to engage students who have been traumatized by the challenges that life has presented. And so I'll talk about being a transformational leader and all the different opportunities that come within that will be important to engaging this work. But in addition, an opportunity to talk about servant leadership as a foreground for transformational leadership so that you can affect change in this work. When we speak about transformation, we oftentimes use constructive strategies, strategic strategies, invitational strategies, and distributive practices. But what we don't always think about is servant strategies. And so if we could embrace those together, we could come out with a way to put people ahead of power and ahead of processes so we can redefine what schooling looks like, but more importantly, how people experience it. So I'd like to talk about generating will, entering into your new school communities with radical love, with this intentionality about loving each and every individual student. And by doing that, you're cultivating relationships built on trust, empathy, listening, and healing. You are aware of what students are thinking, feeling, and have been exposed to. And you are engaging foresight in how to help them cultivate success beyond that. Your commitment in generating will is not to the cognitive aspects of the work, but it's to the people and to the stewardship. That's part of your instructional pedagogy. And now you must build some capacity. You must engage students more individually and more specifically and less like the class. Not only must you engage students in that way, you must build individual job-embedded supports to help teachers and staff members move through their process of social emotional acuity. You've got to make connections during this part of the work. You've got to build partners. You've got to create conditions. And you've got to remind people of the confidence that they once had in themselves and in their ability for self-efficacy and self-agency. And that should be a part of your instructional repertoire. And now I'm talking about shaping the culture, but I'm really talking about reshaping the culture. How do you amplify student voice? How do you elevate it? How do you bring students into focus groups and let their ideas and their understandings help you cultivate a learning experience that is relevant and meaningful? How do you understand that students don't come into your buildings or to your Zoom classrooms with thinking cognitively? They come in feeling, I wonder what this is going to be like. I wonder if people are going to accept me. I wonder if I'm going to be comfortable. How do you acknowledge and validate the need to engage social emotional learning? How do you talk about race and belief systems? How do you bring culturally relevant pedagogy and understandings into your school communities? What do your school communities look like? How do you engage the curriculum? What do we see on the walls? We should be seeing the faces of the students you serve. We should be seeing them engaging in wonderful opportunities of community service, of reading and writing and playing with one another in healthy or responsive ways. Can't forget policy, because policy is really important. It's valuable to what your school community will feel like. Your job is to serve the local needs of the students and the families and the community members that are part of that context. And you must make sure that perceived policies don't provide negative impacts to students who've already been underserved and marginalized. You have to respond proactively and deliberately to not allow policy to disrupt healing or practice. And when we talk about equity, we all know that COVID has had disproportionate effects on Black and Brown students and families. In addition to all the inequities we're feeling around police brutality, murder, and race, we have got to be sensitive to the needs of each individual student. We have got to understand the relationship or the intersectionality of the relationship between culture, race, language, ethnicity, and poverty. We have to create partnerships that help us to understand the traditions and the values of the students we serve so that we can get into the nuances of how their lived experiences shape their ability to learn. And lastly, I will say, how we conceive our understanding of teaching and learning has to be reconceptualized. We have to align our socio-emotional, socio-cultural, socioeconomic understandings of teaching and learning alongside our more cognitive ones. Thank you. Put people ahead of power. And next, I would like to invite you to listen to Lindsey.
There we go. I'm still muted. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Lindsey. It was great to hear both your excitement and passion for this content and all of the work. I kind of want to go be in a school building with you sometime soon. Feels good. So I am here from Transforming Education, and as a partner organization to schools, we work extensively on supporting schools and school leaders in integrating social emotional learning into their systems and structures. I'm also coming to you as, in my heart, a second grade teacher with experience working in 2 different schools in Dorchester and in Cambridge, and also some prior work in pediatric healthcare settings. And so there's much overlapping work in all of these areas. And so we've focused specifically recently at Transforming Education on trauma-informed SEL practices. And the way in which we describe that is an approach to fostering social emotional development that seeks to create a safe and reliable environment where students and staff feel supported, are welcome to explore their strengths and identities, exercise their agency, develop meaningful, positive relationships with adults and peers, and have access to mental health supports that they need. You'll notice that many of those components that I just described were also addressed in Lindsay's comments about everything from policies to relationships to what we see in the physical space. I want to acknowledge that we're not coming up with anything brand new and revolutionary here. Many of the trauma-informed SEL practices are general best practices for students. As this quote indicates here, SEL helps children survive and cope in various situations, and while not all kids will experience trauma, they will all face challenges at some point in their lives. And I think we can all agree that this current situation that we are in is creating uncertainty, stress, anxiety, and trauma for children and adults across the board. And so we're seeing a big uptick in the amount of people interested in social emotional learning and how to support whole children in the school environment. And so I think it's really, really important that as we think about some of these best practices, we're not thinking about them in isolation just in this moment in time, but really as best practices to, as Lindsey was saying, really rethink our systems and our structures. It's important also that we are very intentional about how we are integrating social emotional learning. And as these 5 trauma-informed practices outline, there's a lot of intentionality here. So creating predictable routines, which I'll talk a bit more about, building strong and supportive relationships, empowering student agency, which Lindsey mentioned, support the development of self-regulation and reflection skills, and provide opportunities to explore individual and community identities. One of the things that's important to note here is that the appropriate integration of SEL really works to dismantle oppressive systems rather than perpetuate systems. Dina Simmons says that the misuse of SEL can often be white supremacy with a hug. And so I think when we're talking about trauma, it's really important to think about how are the practices, the policies, and the procedures that we're incorporating into our school environments, whether that is virtual or in person, really working to support the whole of humanity for all of our students. And so we've kind of zoomed in this current moment around trauma-informed SEL on 3 key areas, specifically in this distance learning or virtual world. And those are routines, relationships, and reflection or regulation. And the purpose of routines here is trauma-informed practices show us that the consistency, predictability leads to trust. And this is true for both kids and adults. So not just thinking about students, but also thinking about staff. So having clear established boundaries and guidelines, those routines and structures, helps people to feel safe and supported. In a time of extreme uncertainty and unexpected change, this can fuel stress, anxiety, and fear. And so we want to work as educators and school leaders to bring as much predictability and consistency as we can through some of those routines, while also acknowledging that flexibility and adaptability are huge. The second piece is those relationships. We all know the power of strong relationships. And I love how Lindsey said, just really thinking about that radical love and meeting everybody with true support. So we know from research that the presence of one strong, stable, supportive adult can be a mitigating factor to the impact of adverse childhood experiences, stress, and trauma. And it's the presence of that supportive relationship that can keep highly stressful events and experiences in the tolerable versus the toxic stress zone. And so now is the time to think about how to get creative in leveraging some of those relationships. And lastly, reflection and regulation. Now is not a time to necessarily tell other people how to feel or how to react, but it's really important time to provide opportunities, especially for students, to reflect on their feelings. And that one of the best ways to do that as adults and educators is through modeling. So making time and space for students to name their emotions, process their emotions with honesty and transparency, which sometimes involves acknowledging that you might not have the answers or the best idea for them, but being there to help them reflect and kind of engage with those various emotions through activities like mindfulness practices, journaling, gratitude practices, so that those opportunities are there. So again, just in recap, trauma-informed SEL best practices are best practices for all of our kiddos, regardless of what is happening in the world. And so now we're really called to action to think about how to best integrate these practices into our school environments, whatever those may look like in the fall. But we at Transforming Ed are eager to support anybody looking to do this work more. And at that, Nadja, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay, and good morning to everyone. Thank you to Chad and the Rennie Center for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel. I am inspired by listening to you both, and I want to follow up on a couple of very important themes that you mentioned. As part of my work at William James College, I co-direct a graduate certificate program in school culture and social emotional learning, where we have teams, multidisciplinary teams that come to us from various districts. And over the course of 9 months, we focus on social emotional learning. And we started with the program before the pandemic, and like many of you, we had to switch very, very quickly what we were doing to meet the needs of school districts during the pandemic and then thinking ahead. So I've taken some of the learnings that we've had from that program, and also a lens from being a clinical psychologist, the behavioral health perspective, really focusing on two things: trust, like Lindsay was saying, and intentionality, like Lindsay was mentioning. And of course, we do have to acknowledge that these are incredibly challenging times, characterized by ambiguity and loss and worry, separation, and all of that stress leads us to function under certain assumptions and pulls, right? We want to go to something that we know, we want to go back and make meaning of some things, but it's important to acknowledge, like Linda said, schools are not going to go back and be the same way that they were before. And so we want to identify those assumptions and pulls under which we might be working in order to not get stuck in routines that ultimately lead us to failure. So I want to go through a couple of these potential pulls and assumptions, and perhaps have some time together to think about that more. The first pull that I think is that we're probably going to be compelled to address catching up on all the learning that we feel students might have missed when we go back to school. The feeling of having to create new programs and new lessons. But I want to say that we cannot forget that emotions and learning are so interrelated. And so in order for us to go back, really the most critical area to think about is what the school culture and climate will be like. We have to think about safety that kids are coming in feeling. We have to think about the connections that they're feeling with each other and with their teachers. And the second thing is, as best practices call us to take a look at, we need to look at the adult SEL first before we address child SEL. And so we don't want to come in with the assumption that there's a high level of psychological safety and trust among everyone in the building. That might not be the case, because there is a lot of vulnerability that people have experienced and continue to experience in the context of this pandemic. Things like economic loss, stress, grief, fear for their safety. It's going to be really important to put strategies in place to support all of the collaboration among colleagues. Things like adult community time, check-ins, opportunities for tapping in and tapping out. And one thing, I do believe that mental health providers are going to be called upon significantly to address all of the different presentations. And so I do encourage that other things are put in place. For example, opportunities for peer consultation and debriefing of mental health providers. Another thing I want to focus on is, we might have a pull to go to new roadmaps or create new ways of being, but and that's understandable, because we don't have a template for where we're going. But in the pull to create new things, we don't want to forget those theories of change and those roadmaps that we know are proven to be effective. And so I encourage you to think about prevention as one of those roadmaps that help us in figuring out what to do. We go back to the model of identifying what are the risk factors that we need to address and what are the protective factors that we can encourage and improve. Another piece of prevention is, again, from the behavioral health perspective, a lot of times, I know I'm guilty of this too. We take on the role of, we have to keep going. We have to go produce, go. And if we feel that if we don't give it 100% or 150%, we're not serving the kids the way that we need to. But it's important to stop for a moment and think, we need emotional stamina. This is not going to be a time-limited thing. This is going to take a long time. So I encourage parents, I encourage providers, I encourage all of us to think about how can we be preventive regarding our own mental health. So perhaps you reach out to a mental health provider and examine your toolkit rather than waiting until you're so depleted that you feel paralyzed by your exhaustion. Like Lindsey mentioned, co-regulation is going to be so important, really focusing on self-regulating strategies. And I want to bring this in for the adults too. We might want to think about restructuring the way we do some meetings. So instead of jumping into a meeting, going right into the agenda and jumping into the weeds, if you will, can we take a moment to co-regulate and center and then proceed? And finally, I want to really encourage everyone to assess protocols in a way that looks at what is effective, but what might not be effective. So for example, when we think about tier 3 strategies, it might have been that we offered some names and connections to providers and expected the follow-up to be completely in the hands of families. But we know that when people experience a high number of adverse experiences, they have a harder time connecting to the healthcare and mental health care system. So what could we do differently as a community to build more self-efficacy and community efficacy? So thank you, and I appreciate your time today.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This is if we were actually all able to connect and meet in person, where we would pause for applause and to thank you profusely for being with us and sharing your expertise. So consider this a virtual round of applause, and thank you very much. We'll now shift to the panel discussion, which allows me to stop sharing my screen, which takes an enormous amount of pressure off me. I'll share as we sort of get ourselves situated that of all the folks at the Rennie Center, I am easily the least technologically savvy. So any glitches that you may have seen during the presentation was coming from my end as I attempted to navigate things while our presenters were speaking. And apologies if anything threw you off, if there was a sudden pop-up on your screen. With that in mind, why don't we dig in? I want to ask everyone the same question, but Lindsey, I'll come to you first. And the basic question is, how do we get started? There's a ton of stuff here, right? And on top of that, I mean, these are real issues and they're felt every day by students and families. But when we talk about underlying causes like racism and poverty, they can seem overwhelming or even so abstract it's hard to access. So for educators, for schools and communities, what actions can they take? How would you recommend them getting started?
Thank you for that question. So I would start by having the adults in the community come together in a collective role, assume collective responsibility. And it might mean that you're starting in a place where you're assessing the challenges that adults have experienced throughout this time, much like Naja said. But deal with those through courage and through renewal and through getting yourself in a position that collectively you can engage this work for students. So all hands on deck, shared accountability, collectively building capacity, making education a public pedagogy, not a private opportunity, engaging partners, but keeping your focus on building access and opportunities for students while removing all barriers. I would offer that.
Great, thank you. And Lindsey, Naja, let me come to you with the same question too. And there's multiple ways to get started, so feel free to offer some variety here. But how would you recommend getting started?
Well, I completely agree with Lindsey. I think a systemic approach is so important. So many times we have seen different strategies that are offered in silos. This is not a time to do that. And I love the idea, and this is something that we discuss in our program, of the leadership that is distributed. We have leaders among every single person that is in our system, and we really will need the skills of everyone to bring that community together and to create that sense of safety for everyone in the community. So it shouldn't really be from the top bottom. It really needs to be distributed, as Linda mentioned, for everyone in the system.
And I'll just echo all of those ideas. I think a huge starting place that we don't need to wait for the fall of the new school year is just really spending time on internal reflection and knowledge building. Mm-hmm. I think the more school leaders can share out resources that people can access around doing some of their own internal reflection, but then also building up knowledge. Like, this blueprint is a great place for people to be able to click around and say, what? I hear about trauma-informed practices all the time. What does trauma actually mean? What is it and what is it not? I think a lot of that knowledge building is really critical, especially when we think about some of the connections with neuroscience and how it impacts brain development. And what we're seeing in classrooms or over Zoom calls. I think that's a really critical piece, because then from there, educators can really develop their best practices from this baseline of knowledge. And then also, I would say in terms of some of like those initial foundational strategies is really leveraging relationships. And as both Lindsay and Nadia had indicated, this is not just about students, this is about staff too. So really embedding and integrating opportunities for people to have time and space to continue existing relationships and also build and reestablish relationships, because there has been such an interruption for so many people. We can't underestimate the importance of giving time and space for that relationship building.
Great. Thank you. Lindsay, let me stay with you for a second. And your answer also led me to think, okay, we talked about where to get started, but how do you scaffold to allow also for longer term planning, right? Where do those initial steps lead to? And do you have recommendations for sort of building a larger plan that allows for transformation? Are there resources that you might identify for people that they could tap into?
Yeah, I think about this really the same way that I think about like lesson planning in the classroom setting. I think especially school leaders have a responsibility to really zoom out and think about sort of like backwards planning. What are the things that they want their students and staff to both understand, but also how do they want students and staff to feel in the school building? And then think, what are the pieces that need to be in place to get there? And I would say one of my biggest lessons learned is do not bite off more than you can chew. There are so many amazing things we could all be doing at any given moment, but doing all of them is not going to work. And quite frankly, it's going to overwhelm both staff and students. If there's a healing circle here and a morning meeting here and a check-in here, and people don't know which way to look, and then they start to sort of just not trust any of those systems. So I think being very, very intentional, as Nadia pointed out, around like, what is the focus? And then communicating that focus back to staff, and so staff can communicate it to students. That coherence and everybody being aligned is really key to success in this area. And I think that's a really, really important starting point.
If I could just add, I think it's important too to start to do some asset mapping and to be able to see your resources beyond what you have in your immediate school community, but as an opportunity to utilize local resources. Many of the challenges are going to be social in nature or non-academic, but they will reflect themselves in the academic instructional part of learning. And so how do you use the community to build and create sustainable opportunities to address real life problems? And the second thing I would add is that we can talk about trauma and maybe we understand it, but do we know how to engage trauma-sensitive pedagogical techniques in the context of the classroom that don't further exacerbate a child's particular state of being, right? And if we don't, then how can our professional development allow for opportunities for teachers to learn that?
Thank you both, and I just would offer a couple more points. One is, I think this is a really key moment for us to take a look at the data that we're using to determine our outcomes. And for a long time, the data was very, very much number driven in terms of what are the grades, what are the test scores. And so this is an opportunity for us to really assess how are we measuring our success? How are we communicating the whole process, right? That was very specific outcome based. And right now we need to take a look at process, and we need to redefine some outcomes from a more social emotional learning perspective. What we want is to teach kids resilience and the self-efficacy that they can make it through these hard times with agency and power and connection. So I would vote for, in addition to the resource mapping, to take a look at what data are we using, and always ask each other, to what end? Okay, so we're putting in this intervention to what end? How is it connected to our larger goal?
Right, thank you, everyone. One thing I heard, although there are certainly many ideas shared, is that, one of the fundamental causes for what we see in trauma and, why we struggle to build strong communities is the underlying inequities in our system. And, obviously we all probably share the same motivation to transform that system, to make it more equitable. And we can feel sometimes, if we're not taking on everything at once, what we're doing is insufficient. But we also need a plan with specific steps that will take us far if we actually really want to achieve that change. And so, Lindsey, back to your point, like, make sure that you can do what you're doing, as you move forward. Naja, can I come to you, and what you were reflecting on with data, struck me, as well as a comment you made earlier in your presentation about how, there's sometimes an immediate desire to start with learning loss, but if students aren't in a safe and supportive environment, if trauma isn't being attended to, they're not going to learn. How do you actually recognize trauma? What are people looking for? And that can either be data informed, or it can be more through interpersonal interactions, but how does it manifest itself?
Sure. Well, I think obviously we need to consider different developmental presentations, but right away I would take a look at some kids might manifest trauma with more internalizing presentations. So they might seem more worried, more anxious, more internally distracted, disconnected, whereas some kids might manifest it in a much more externalizing way, where you would see a lot of dysregulation in their behavior, maybe quick to anger, being very hypervigilant about their environment. And so we need to take a look at those sort of more outline presentations, but I think we also need to be more preventive in that whether kids already came in with a history of trauma or not, I think most of the kids will come in with a lot of distractions from already not knowing what's going to happen or questioning what will be safe or not. And so I think using a tier 1 prevention intervention where we're looking at trauma sensitive and healing centered, I really want to emphasize that part, which is what is right with you, is going to be really critical. The other piece I want to mention is that kids might not be able to verbalize this for us. So building an emotional vocabulary and giving them opportunities to kind of practice that is going to be really critical. And I would advocate for doing that in the adult meetings too.
And if I could just add in support of what Naja just shared, developing a multi-tiered system of support that acknowledges the validity of trauma, social emotional learning, the values, the beliefs, and the abilities of the students we're serving is going to be key, while simultaneously deconstructing structures and spaces that live within your school communities that perpetuate exclusion and compromise equity.
And I'll also just add to that point, to both what Naja and Lindsey are pointing out, is it's really important to, I think, especially for classroom teachers to sort of like know their limits in terms of where they can best support and step in, and to remember that we're not in the business of diagnosing. And it's really important that people understand we don't, as educators, get to determine if somebody else has experienced trauma. It is how they experience the situation that in and of itself defines whether or not it was traumatic. So really making sure we're examining some of our own biases and some of our own perceptions of situations before we decide, oh, this kid is really upset, they must be traumatized. Really looking at the big picture, and then catering educator responses to student behavior so that the intervention really does meet the need. If there is a mismatch, if you're working with a student in a way to try to support trauma when really something else is totally going on, that's going to be really hard to navigate. So I think that's an important piece too, is kind of examining what lens we're bringing to the situation. And then I really just want to emphasize the point that Lindsay made too about all of this has to be done in the context of examining policies and systems that as educators and school leaders, we may not have realized that they are perpetuating some of these modes of trauma and stress. And so really having the humility and vulnerability to step back and say like, wow, are any of the things we're doing as a school or an educational institution re-traumatizing students or our staff? And I think that's a critical step.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. And one of the things your comments reminded me of as well is, we're guilty of saying school communities today because we thought it gave everyone an access point for discussion, but we really mean all places that students learn. And we don't just mean the school building. And part of this work is connecting students and families and faculty to other organizations within the community, healthcare providers, particularly some that may be qualified and certified to deal with specific issues, but also social service agencies, after school programming and summer program that all create a larger network for students. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to alert the audience here. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You can open that up and you can offer questions, which we'd be happy to answer or address in the remaining time. We already have one in there, so I will start there. The question basically is a follow-up to, I believe, Lindsay, your comment about thinking through trauma-sensitive pedagogical practice. And particularly, are there resources available or recommendations regarding meaningful relationships, as well as creating safety in classroom practices? I will note before turning it over to all of you that the action guides we presented earlier do have links and resources that align with that question. So you can tap into, for instance, responsive classroom that might address some of the questions that you're raising, the way it was framed. But to our panelists, any recommendations on pedagogical practice to address relationships, classroom climate, or other factors?
Well, I would say the first place to start is with the literature that you presented. I mean, there's a new piece coming out real soon, and I've had the privilege to work with the folks at Harvard on presenting. So yeah, Learn and Traumatized strategies is important, and you're offering that. But again, I would say there's a lot of local health communities that can come in and provide the services. I know in the Boston area, we learned from WDECO, mental health services, how to engage trauma-sensitive pedagogical practices in the classroom, how to not personalize a child's experience around trauma as an insult to our lesson plan. And so I would say a good place to start is a local health agency or the library or your text. And of course, my colleagues here.
I will also just add that the slide that I showed is pulled from our trauma-informed SEL toolkit, which has a number of references and resources in it that are quite actionable. And I believe that toolkit is also embedded into the blueprint. So again, that's just sort of like the portal to many resources, which is great. A couple other like really quick accessible things is there's a book called Fostering Resilient Learners, which I have found is incredibly user-friendly for some really great like 101 kind of information in a very accessible read. As well as the text, All Learning is Social Emotional. Those two I find are really great for a wide range of people coming to this work from different places. And then I think also linked in the blueprint, there's a great series of videos from Edutopia called How Learning Happens. And they are fantastic for like professional development staff meetings, show a 4-minute video and then kind of discuss debrief process as a staff. I think that can be a great way to see some of these things in practice. It's footage from real classrooms, real schools all over the country. And it's nice to sometimes see it rather than just to read about it on paper. So those are some quick suggestions too.
Couple of things in addition to those great resources that you mentioned. The Children's Trauma Network also has some really important information that's also linked to the blueprints. Culturally Responsive Teaching is a wonderful book that really helps us to understand the neuroscience behind what might be getting impacted as a result of systemic trauma too. But this is a great opportunity. There are some trauma interventions, such as the use of rhythmicity and music and storytelling that can be very soothing. And that's such a great opportunity to bring in cultural traditions, to bring in stories from multiple perspectives that can really help the students create a much richer classroom community. So I would encourage infusing that cultural piece in there as well.
All right, thank you, everyone. We had another question come in that was picking up on an earlier comment that schools can unintentionally add to trauma if they're not thoughtful about how they engage with students and families and their own staff. Can any of you comment a little bit more on that? What might be potential mistakes that people might make, and are there ways to correct for them?
I would just say this. The biggest mistake is to assume that you know what students are thinking and feeling, but in opposition to that, set up opportunities to hear from them, whether it's an advisory, whether it's you're just focusing on a focus group, to bring their voice, to amplify and elevate their voice in your planning. So not to plan without them, plan with them.
I really want to underscore that, Linda. Thank you for bringing that up. The Aspen Institute recently put out a report with a very notable question, which was, who is at the table when these decisions are being made? And so making assumptions that old ways of functioning will function just with a tweak, or making the assumptions that we have the answers to what we need, I think will get us in trouble. And so really, even if it means slowing down the pace of what you think you should be getting done at any moment, I think being intentional about how you include is going to be critical.
One practice that we're using here in Boston is called the Equity Roundtables. And so in an Equity Roundtable, we're inviting practitioners, other members of the local community, faith-based partners, healthcare partners to join us in problem solving or in creating more opportunities for our students to have better life outcomes. And so we engage those equity roundtables with the problem of practice weekly.
Thank you. So I think we might have time for one more question. We'll see how it goes. It was raised that what can or should we be doing right now for students who are struggling to access school communities remotely, whether it's due to environmental factors, a digital divide, a lack of technology, or for any other reason. Are there actions we should be taking? And I assume particularly around with the focus on potential trauma.
Well, I'll just tell you, Boston passed out about 32,000 Chromebooks and delivered well over 2,000 hotspots to students just to address the access challenge. But out of our 54,000 students, there were about 125 students that we were yet to connect with. And so what we developed were, on the ground foot opportunities to go out and to find those students either through friends using Facebook or Instagram, or teachers who had personal relations, or using our community field coordinators to do a drive-by. And so engagement is key. And when we found our students, what we found were many of them were working during the synchronous learning at times. And so we created either recordings or other opportunities for them to learn based on their schedules. So whether it's Saturday or Friday night, just so that they could somehow be accessible to learn.
I'll just add to one of the things that I've heard is don't assume just because a message wasn't answered that it wasn't received. And I think sometimes the amount of information coming in, especially for students depending on their developmental age, the amount of information could be overwhelming. And just because you don't hear back after checking in with a student doesn't mean they didn't receive that message and really internalize that, like, oh wow, that person thought to reach out to me. We think about the number of text messages and Instagram posts and social media feeds that many of us and students are following. And so I would also just encourage people to not consider a lack of a response of a lack of care, or that it didn't get to that other person. That's just a subtle thing to point out too.
Great, thank you. Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
Thing I would say is that we've been noticing a lot of kids who are struggling with attentional issues are really having a hard time connecting because of things like, oh, I didn't know where the submit button was, or, I didn't know where to access this. So in addition to all of the wonderful things that my colleagues have said, I might just say you can also reach out and say what's working for you and what's not working for you, and maybe create some tailored plans that might help kids just be able to ask better questions and access things differently.
Right. Thank you. So unfortunately, we are up against the clock. First and foremost, I want to thank our panelists one more time, virtual applause, but we greatly appreciate you being with us and sharing your expertise. I also want to acknowledge there was one question we didn't get to about resources, and understandably that some of the things we're talking about may cost money. I want to give a couple quick answers to that. One is that there are communities and districts that are finding ways to do this on current budgets. Lindsey mentioned some of the work that Boston has done, although not all of that was due to pre-existing budgets. But the district has been working for a long time on culturally and linguistically sustaining practices and working that into their curriculum. There's other communities similarly that have made similar commitments, like Andover Public Schools, which has a fairly comprehensive approach to student social and emotional learning. And I'm sure they'd be happy to connect and share tips about how they are doing it with the resources they currently have. And we're happy to make connections. So reach out to the Rennie Center and we can be a starting point for you all. Beyond that, two other quick things. The Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, which I'm sure they wouldn't mind me plugging here, runs a number of academies, all aligned under their multi-tiered system of supports. There's one on social emotional learning and mental health that Transforming Ed, Lindsey's organization, is connected with. The Rennie Center runs one on integrated student supports with City Connects out of Boston College that focuses on connecting schools to other community resources. And there's a host of others on issues from school climate to PBIS and the like. And then finally, the Rennie Center does run a network called Excel with Transforming Education, again, excellence in social and emotional learning. That does have a cost to it. I want to be upfront about that. However, the focus this year is on helping schools respond specifically to the social emotional needs of students and their families in response to the COVID-19 pandemic as schools begin to reopen. So a little information there on where to go next if you're hoping to develop some practice in work communities. And then finally, the question came through a couple times, but just to say it out loud, all of these resources will be made available to you on the Rennie Center's website, www.renniecenter.org. Both the action guides, which are already currently posted, and the webinar, as soon as we get it cleaned and ready, will be up there on the website for folks to review. Thank you very much. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to the Rennie team behind the scenes that made this possible. And we look forward to connecting with people in the future. Take care.
Thank you.